The statistics are public. Darwin has the highest rate of assault per capita of any capital city in Australia, the highest rate of sexual assault, the highest rate of robbery. By most measures of violent crime, it is in a category of its own. But that is not the secret. The secret is what Darwin has been built on, and built over, and built around, and what the city prefers not to say out loud, even now, even after everything that has been documented and investigated and quietly filed away. The secret is in the land itself, in the history beneath the streets, and in a series of events so extraordinary that the official record closes its eyes and moves on. I am going to tell you 12 of those things today. Number 1 is something that happened in Darwin, something that involved the Australian government, something documented in declassified files, and something most Australians have never heard about even though it happened in their own country. Stay with me. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. And let's begin. Darwin is the capital of the Northern Territory. Population approximately 150,000. Built on a harbour facing north toward Asia, in a landscape of tropical savanna and ancient sandstone escarpment occupied for at least 65,000 years before the British arrived. It is also the most bombed city in Australian history, a fact that represents only the most visible layer of what Darwin has experienced. What follows is not the Darwin of the tourist brochure, not the Sunset Cruise, not Mindle Beach, not the crocodiles at Crocosaurus Cove. What follows is the Darwin the brochure leaves out. On February 19, 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin in 2 waves, the largest foreign attack on Australian soil in history. The official death toll was declared to be 243. The actual number was higher. The government had strong reasons to minimise the figures. Civilian morale was a strategic asset. But the undercounting was also structural. Aboriginal workers present in Darwin were not recorded with the same thoroughness as European casualties. Transient workers whose employment records were incomplete. People whose informal presence was not documented. Historians, including Dr. Tom Lewis, have produced counts substantially higher than 243. The exact number will never be known. Construction projects in Darwin still occasionally encounter human remains from the war period. The ground absorbed more than the official record admits. On Christmas morning 1974, Cyclone Tracy destroyed Darwin. 71 people were killed. 40,000 were evacuated. About 12,000 returned to rebuild. The official toll is not disputed in the way the 1942 figures are. But the evacuation was applied unevenly. Aboriginal communities were not given the same urgency or resources as non-Indigenous areas. People who died in the days and weeks after the cyclone, from injuries and exposure and the failure of support to reach them in time, were not always counted in the death toll. The line between direct casualties and casualties of inadequate response was drawn in ways that made the response look more adequate than it was. The official death toll of 71 is correct by the terms in which it was defined. The terms were chosen carefully. The Don Dale Youth Detention Centre became the centre of a national controversy in 2016 when the ABC's Four Corners broadcast footage of guards mistreating detained young people. Children being hooded, strapped to restraint chairs, tear-gassed, subjected to conditions that Australia's human rights frameworks explicitly prohibit. The Royal Commission that followed found systemic failures across the Northern Territory youth detention system. The mistreatment was not isolated. Aboriginal children were vastly overrepresented and subjected to the harshest conditions. But Don Dale was not the beginning. It was the moment what had been happening became visible to the rest of Australia. The Berrima prison, which operated until 1996, had its own history of conditions subject to complaint, investigation, and inadequate reform for decades. Darwin is a long way from the southern cities where Australian public discourse is made. What happens in Darwin's institutions takes longer to surface. When it surfaces, the institutions have had longer to become entrenched. Don Dale was not an aberration. It was what the system looked like when someone finally turned on the lights. The policy of removing Aboriginal children from their families, the stolen generations, was applied across Australia, but in the Northern Territory with particular intensity and duration. Darwin was the administrative centre from which removal policies were coordinated and the location of institutions to which removed children were sent. The Carlin Compound, on the edge of Darwin, was the largest Aboriginal institution in the Territory. At its peak, it housed hundreds of people, children separated from families, adults removed from country, people classified under racist legislative frameworks as subjects to be managed. Movement in and out was controlled. The people inside had no legal status that gave them rights the government was obliged to respect. The Carlin compound operated for decades. The stories of those who lived in it, grew up in it, died in it are in the oral histories of Darwin's Aboriginal communities. They are not fully in any official document. The site is now suburban Darwin. Houses have been built on it. Streets have been named. The ground beneath those streets absorbed decades of a policy Australia formally acknowledged, through the 2008 National Apology, as a profound injustice. The apology is in the record. The compound is beneath the suburb. In 1932 and 1933, a series of violent incidents in Arnhem Land produced a crisis that reached the highest levels of the Australian government. Japanese trepang fishermen were killed by the Yolengu people of Caledon Bay. A mounted constable and his party were killed shortly afterward. The government's initial response was to send a punitive expedition, the standard colonial response to Aboriginal resistance. It was ultimately not deployed, partly through missionary intervention arguing the violence had occurred in a context of prior mistreatment of the Yolengu. The crisis produced a documented record of frontier conditions that had been occurring without public visibility for decades. Darwin was the administrative centre through which that frontier was governed. The violence, done to Aboriginal people, and committed by them in response to having their country invaded, passed through Darwin's courts and institutions. The records are there. They are not the records the tourism brochures reference. Darwin is over 1,500 kilometres from Pine Gap, the joint Australian-American Signals Intelligence Facility outside Alice Springs. But Darwin's military significance and Pine Gap's intelligence significance are connected in ways the public record does not fully illuminate. Pine Gap monitors electronic communications across a vast area including most of Asia, one of the most significant intelligence facilities in the world. Darwin's role as Australia's northern military hub means the intelligence gathered at Pine Gap flows through Darwin's infrastructure. The expansion of Darwin's military facilities, US Marine rotations, upgraded RAAF Darwin, the deepening US-Australia strategic relationship, is connected to an intelligence picture of which Pine Gap is a central element. Darwin is the civilian face of a military and intelligence operation whose full scope is not public. The sunset cruise on the harbour is real. The military significance of that harbour is also real, and significantly less visible. The British nuclear weapons tests at Maralinga are the best-known component of the testing program Britain conducted in Australia between 1952 and 1963. The territory was connected to it in ways less publicly discussed. Across the testing period, logistics and military infrastructure ran through Darwin's port and airfield. Aboriginal people in affected regions were not warned, not consulted, and not protected. Patrol officers assigned to keep them away from test zones could not cover the terrain. People walked through contaminated country, drank contaminated water, were never told what had happened. This is documented in the Royal Commission that investigated the testing program in the 1980s. Darwin administered the territory. The territory failed its Aboriginal population during the nuclear era. The decisions that produced that failure were made by people working in Darwin. Christmas Island is technically an Australian territory in the Indian Ocean, not the Northern Territory. But the decisions that produced Australia's offshore detention system were implemented through the infrastructure of the northern approaches that Darwin represents. The Narruru and Manus Island facilities, indefinite detention of asylum seekers, deaths in detention, mental illness produced by indefinite uncertainty, children in conditions medical bodies described as causing lasting harm, are connected to the same geography that makes Darwin Australia's northern military gateway. The boats were intercepted in waters Darwin faces. The system was made possible by Darwin's strategic position. The humanitarian cost of offshore detention is not specifically a Darwin story, but it is a northern story, and Darwin is the north. The Northern Territory has the largest saltwater crocodile population in the world. The Darwin region alone contains thousands of animals in the harbour, estuaries, rivers, floodplains, and coastal waterways surrounding the city. The official death toll from crocodile attacks is documented and not large by conventional comparison, but it represents only the deaths that were found. A saltwater crocodile that takes a person in a remote river system leaves very little evidence. The death may not be reported for days. The body may not be recovered at all. The number of unrecorded deaths in the Darwin region and wider top end is not known. It is not zero. The country is vast, the water systems complex, the crocodile population large. What the rivers and estuaries have taken and not returned has not been fully counted. This is not a horror story. It is a geography. The crocodile country around Darwin is one of the most biologically extraordinary landscapes on Earth, and one that has absorbed the consequences of underestimation for as long as people have been in it. Darwin is built on Larakia country. The Larakia people, the saltwater people, have lived in the Darwin region for tens of thousands of years. Their connection to this land is not historical in the sense of being past. It is present. They are still here. The places within Darwin that carry Larakia cultural significance, sacred sites, ceremony grounds, places connecting the living to the ancestral, exist within and beneath and around a city built on them without consent. Formal acknowledgement of country happens before every government meeting and most public events. The acknowledgement is real. The incompleteness is also real. Saying we acknowledge the traditional owners of this land before a council meeting does not resolve the land rights question, the housing crisis affecting Aboriginal people in Darwin, the incarceration rate, or the cultural heritage disrupted by the construction of the city. Darwin acknowledges the country it sits on. It has not yet fully reckoned with what that acknowledgement requires. Before Don Dale, there was the Northern Territory National Emergency Response, the intervention, announced in 2007. The intervention suspended the Racial Discrimination Act. It applied only to Aboriginal communities. It removed community control over land use, welfare payments, and governance in prescribed areas. It was announced in response to a report on child abuse in Aboriginal communities, a report whose authors subsequently stated their findings had been misrepresented in the policy response. Darwin was the point through which the intervention was administered. The NT government, federal territory operations, the military, and police who implemented the rollout, all of this passed through Darwin's administrative infrastructure. Its legacy is contested. Some proponents argue it addressed real child protection failures. Critics, including many researchers whose work was used to justify it, argue it extended and deepened the dispossession of Aboriginal people in ways the child protection rationale did not justify, under legislation that suspended their legal protections in ways that should never have been legally possible. Darwin administered a policy imposed on Aboriginal communities without their consent. This is in the public record. It is not in the tourist brochure. This is not a single event. It is not a buried document or a classified file or a forgotten crime. It is the thing that Darwin lives with every day, in plain sight, that the rest of Australia has been managing its awareness of for over 2 centuries. Darwin is an Australian city with a majority Aboriginal population in the surrounding territory and a systematic failure to translate that demographic reality into political power, economic equity, or basic service equality. The Aboriginal people of the Darwin region experience rates of incarceration, child removal, preventable illness, and poverty incompatible with any honest description of a just society. These numbers are not secret. The Closing the Gap framework has been measuring the distance between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians since 2008. After 15 years, most gaps have not closed. Some have widened. Darwin is where the gap is most visible. The people sleeping rough in Darwin's parks. The children in the youth detention system. The families in overcrowded remote housing. The Aboriginal elders in Darwin hospitals who travelled hundreds of kilometres for care their communities cannot access locally. The tourist sees the harbour, the sunset, the market, the crocodiles. The secret Darwin carries is not hidden. It is in the street. It is in the numbers. It is in the gap between what Australia says it is and what it demonstrably is, measured in the lives of people whose country the city was built on without consent. This is Australia's most dangerous city. Its most dangerous quality is not its crime rate. It is the gap between the story the city tells about itself and the reality that lives beside that story every day. Darwin is extraordinary. The harbour, the country, the complexity of the place, it earns every superlative. And it deserves to be understood completely. Not just the sunset. All of it. See you in the next one.